She has been used to frighten children for over 3,000 years. In Greece, mothers whispered her name in the dark, not as a myth, not as a story, as a warning. She crept through walls, reached into cradles, and left nothing behind but grief and fever. And yet, in a civilization that existed long before Greece ever carved its first marble column, the same being, carrying the same symbols, was not a monster at all. She was divine. Welcome to Eternal Legends. Today we are going somewhere most mythology channels never reach. Not just into the myth, but underneath it. Behind the Greek version you probably already know. Down into Babylon, into the deep clay of Mesopotamia, into the oldest surviving religious texts on Earth. Because what we find there does not look like a monster. It looks like a goddess. And if that reconstruction is even partially correct, then one of the most famous female terrors in all of classical mythology is not an original creation. She is a damaged echo. A translation made through layers of conquest, religious replacement, and the long, slow drift of stories across centuries and borders, until the worship was stripped away and only the fear remained. If that kind of history is what you come here for, subscribe to Eternal Legends and leave a comment below. Have you ever heard the name Lamia before today? I want to know. In ancient Greece, her name was Lamia, and before she became a monster, she was a queen. The oldest Greek accounts place her in Libya, a real geographic location, not a mythical one, where she ruled as a mortal woman of remarkable beauty. Some sources say she was from Argos. The details shift depending on the writer, the century, the city. But one element stays constant across almost every version of the story. She caught the attention of Zeus. And if you know anything about Greek mythology, you already understand what that means. Being chosen by Zeus is not a blessing. It is the beginning of a punishment that is not yet yours to receive. Hera, Zeus's wife, responded the way Hera always does. Not by confronting her husband, by destroying the woman instead. What happened to Lamia was not a transformation in the ordinary sense. It was not a curse of ugliness or a change of shape delivered in a flash of divine anger. What Hera reportedly did was worse and more specific. She took Lamia's children, one by one. Every child she had born was removed from her, and in some versions of the story, Lamia was forced to watch and was given no mercy, and was given no end to it. Grief, when it has nowhere to go, eventually curdles into something else entirely. Lamia became the creature. Unable to sleep, because Hera had reportedly stolen even that from her, she wandered the night. She entered homes. She approached cradles. She became the thing that takes children. The name Greek parents whispered to keep their sons and daughters from straying too close to the dark, too close to open windows, too close to unguarded sleep. Later Greek writers added details. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, described her with a distorted and disturbing face. Other accounts gave her a serpent's body below the waist, a figure half woman and half snake, coiled in the shadows of places where children were left alone. Some said she possessed removable eyes, that she could take them out, set them on a surface, go temporarily blind. This was supposedly her one vulnerability, the only moment when she could be tricked or escaped. Philosophers used her as a rhetorical device. Dio Chrysostom invoked the image of Lamia to describe the appearance of something attractive on the surface that conceals something genuinely dangerous underneath. She became, in the educated Greek tradition, a symbol of misleading appearances, of the truth hidden beneath the face. But here is what matters. Strip away the literary embellishments. Remove the rhetoric, the philosophical usage, the horror story details added by later writers with their own agendas. What remains at the core of the Greek Lamia? A woman connected to children. A woman connected to the night. a woman who inhabits the edges of civilization, who moves through the dark, uncontrolled, operating in the hours when ordinary protective structures fail. And a woman whose association with children is described as predatory in the Greek tradition, but who was, before the story began, a mother, a protector who was unmade. That detail is important. It is not the kind of detail you invent from nothing. It is the kind of detail that survives a translation because it was load-bearing in the original version. Something about this figure's original relationship to children was central enough to her identity that even the demonized Greek retelling could not fully remove it. It only inverted it. And then there is her name, Lamia. 2 syllables that, when you set them beside a specific word from Babylonian religious texts, do not feel accidental. That word is lamashtu. Let's go back approximately 3,000 years before the Greek accounts were written down. In Mesopotamia, in the clay tablet archives of Babylon, and the even older records of Sumer, there is a figure that scholars call lamashtu. And the moment you examine what she is, what she does, and what she represents within her own religious system, the overlap with the Greek Lamia becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss. Lamashtu is not a broken queen. She is not a human woman punished by a jealous goddess. She is divine. She is, according to Babylonian religious texts, the daughter of Anu, the supreme sky god, the ruler of the entire Mesopotamian pantheon. Her cruelty, and it is cruelty, is not the product of grief or madness. It is entirely her own, freely chosen, answering to no higher power. In Mesopotamian terms, that distinction matters enormously. She is not an agent acting on someone else's orders. She is not a lesser spirit unleashed by accident. She is a being of divine status and independent will. And what does she do with that will? She targets pregnant women and newborns. She causes fevers in infants. She approaches cradles in the night. She is described as entering through the walls of houses, moving through the cracks, drawn specifically to the most vulnerable lives, the ones not yet established, the ones still on the threshold between arrival and survival. The iconography surrounding her is extraordinarily specific and has remained consistent across centuries of Babylonian art. She has the head of a lioness. She has the teeth and ears of a donkey. Her feet are the taloned feet of a bird of prey. She holds serpents in her hands. She is depicted nursing a dog at one breast and a pig at the other. A deeply deliberate image of inverted, poisoned motherhood. Not the nourishing figure, the consuming one. She is connected to the desert wind. She is connected to the wild places at the edge of civilization, the dry mountains, the dead riverbeds, the territory beyond the walls of the city where the laws of the community no longer apply. She moves between those spaces and the domestic interior, crossing boundaries that should not be crossable. And here is the detail that changes everything about how you understand her status. She cannot simply be defeated. Babylonian exorcism rituals, and there are many of them, preserved on clay tablets and studied by scholars for over a century, do not attempt to destroy Lamashtu. They attempt to negotiate with her. Priests constructed small clay figures in her detailed likeness. They dressed those figures in tiny garments. They placed miniature sandals on the clay feet. They prepared a small symbolic bag of provisions, food for a journey. Then they placed the figure on a reed raft and sent it down the Euphrates River, hoping that the gift and the formal acknowledgement of her divine status would persuade her to move on. You do not negotiate with a simple monster. You do not offer provisions and acknowledge status when dealing with something that is merely dangerous. That is the protocol for addressing a god you cannot afford to offend. That is religious diplomacy directed at a being who has legitimate standing, legitimate rank, and who can choose to accept your offer or refuse it. In Babylon, Lamashtu was feared. She was deeply, genuinely feared. But she was also addressed with a form of ceremonial respect that the Greek tradition never extends to Lamia. Because in Greece, Lamia has no cult, no temple, no priesthood, no ritual dedicated specifically to her. She exists only as a warning, only as a name in the dark. The phonetic similarity, Lamia, Lamashtu, has been noted by scholars of comparative mythology for well over a century. The connection is not universally accepted, and I will not tell you it is proven. That would be dishonest, and this channel does not trade in false certainty. But the behavioral overlap is striking enough and specific enough that dismissing the similarity requires more effort than taking it seriously. Both figures target children. Both are connected to the night and to the dangerous hours of infancy. Both carry an association with inverted motherhood, the figure of care transformed into the figure of threat. Both cross the boundary between the safe domestic space and something wilder and more dangerous outside it. The difference is in the framing. In Babylon, a goddess with divine lineage and her own agency. In Greece, a destroyed woman with nothing left. That gap between those two versions of the same essential being is where this story actually begins. Let's talk about what conquest actually does to a goddess. This is not speculation. It is one of the most well-documented patterns in the entire history of religion, and it operates with a consistency that is almost mechanical once you recognize it. When a conquering culture arrives, militarily, economically, or through the slower pressure of cultural dominance, it rarely destroys the old religion outright. That would be too obvious, too blunt, and often too dangerous because the population still believes. What it does instead is more efficient and far more permanent. It reclassifies. The gods of the conquered people do not disappear. They are demoted. The goddess becomes a demon. The protector becomes the threat. The divine figure is stripped of her priesthood, her temples, her formal rituals. And what remains in the cultural memory afterward is just the fear that was once attached to her, severed from the reverence that used to balance it. This process happened across the ancient Near East on a scale that we are still mapping. The goddess Inanna, who was later called Ishtar in Babylon, was one of the most powerful divine figures in the ancient world for thousands of years. She was a goddess of love and of war, of grain and of the morning star. She descended into the underworld and returned from it. She held what the Sumerians called the Me, the divine laws that govern civilization itself. She was not a gentle or subordinate figure. She was formidable, unpredictable, and absolutely central to the cosmology of her civilization. And yet, over centuries of shifting power between city-states, religious competition, and the absorption of one culture into another, figures like Inanna were sometimes elevated and sometimes significantly reduced. Attributes were transferred between deities. A goddess in one city could be a functionally different figure 50 miles away, carrying an overlapping name and an incompatible mythology. Merger, reduction, and reclassification were standard tools of religious administration in the ancient world. Now consider Anatolia, the Hurrian culture, which flourished in what is now northern Syria and southeastern Turkey from roughly the 3rd millennium BCE onward, had its own rich tradition of powerful feminine divine figures. Some of these were absorbed into Babylonian religious practice. Some influenced later Hittite mythology. Some traces of them appear in what would eventually become Levantine and, much later, Greek tradition. There is a figure that appears across this entire region with notable consistency. Not always under the same name, but under the same cluster of symbols. She is associated with lions. She is associated with birds of prey, particularly the owl, the bird of the night. She is associated with serpents. She is associated with the dangerous passage of childbirth, that threshold between life not yet arrived and life not yet secured. She appears in liminal spaces, in doorways and edges, in the exact territory between the safe and the unsafe. In one cultural context, she is protective. She is a divine figure who guards that dangerous threshold precisely because she understands it, because she belongs to it. In another context, as the culture around her shifts and the old priests are displaced, she becomes the danger itself. The same lion and serpent and night wind that once read as signs of divine authority over a dangerous domain begin to read as signs of a creature that haunts it. This is not metaphor. There is physical archaeological evidence for this shift. Iconographic analysis of cylinder seals and carved reliefs from the early 2nd millennium BCE shows protective female figures with taloned feet, flanked by owls and lions, standing on mountain peaks or at thresholds. Some of these images scholars have grouped under what they informally call a Queen of the Night archetype, a term borrowed in part from a famous Babylonian terracotta relief now housed in the British Museum, dating to roughly the 18th or 19th century BCE. That specific relief shows a winged female figure, nude, with the feet of a bird of prey, flanked by owls, standing on the backs of 2 lions, wearing a horned crown. The horned crown in Mesopotamian iconography is not a decorative feature. It is the exclusive marker of divinity. Only gods wear it. And yet we do not know with certainty who this figure is. Scholars have proposed Ishtar. They have proposed Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. They have proposed Lamashtu herself. The debate is ongoing, and the honest answer is that the image may deliberately encompass all of them. That we are looking at a representation of a divine feminine archetype so ancient and so layered that the individual identities had already blurred before anyone thought to write them down. What we can say is this: somewhere between that ancient relief and the Greek story of a grief-destroyed Libyan queen, a transformation took place. A divine figure associated with night, with children, with serpents and lions and the wild edges of the known world. A figure whose connection to that dangerous territory was once understood as sovereignty over it, was carried westward, through trade routes, through migration, through centuries of contact between Near Eastern and early Greek culture. And somewhere along that journey, the sacred half of her identity was lost. What arrived in Greece was only the teeth. We are nearly at the end, and this is where it gets genuinely unsettling. Here is what the reconstruction looks like when you lay it out honestly and hold it against the light. In Greece, Lamia is a monster. She has no cult, no temple, no formal ritual, no priesthood, no ceremony designed specifically for her. She exists only in warnings, in nightmares, in the breath of a parent over a cradle. Her origin story in Greek mythology is itself a story of destruction. She was something else once, something that had standing and dignity and a life that mattered, and all of it was taken. Even within the Greek tradition, the myth carries the echo of a prior status that was stripped away. That is not how monsters are usually introduced. Monsters in Greek mythology are typically explained by origin, born from chaos, created by divine punishment, spawned from a specific transgression. Lamia's story is unusual because it begins not with the creation of a monster, but with the unmaking of something that was not one. In Babylon, Lamashtu is a goddess. She is terrible and genuinely threatening, and feared in ways that shape daily life for ordinary Mesopotamian families across thousands of years. But she has form. She has ritual. She has a divine genealogy that places her inside the structure of the cosmos rather than outside it. She is addressed, negotiated with, appealed to, because her status demands it. The Babylonians did not pretend she did not exist or reduce her to a whisper. They dealt with her directly, with the seriousness you extend to something that has legitimate power and legitimate rank. Now push back further. Before Babylon. Before the standardized Akkadian texts that give us the detailed, consistent Lamashtu mythology of the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. Before that. What was she? The honest answer is that we do not know. The record thins. The clay tablets become rarer. The names scatter and become inconsistent. And that uncertainty is not a weakness in this reconstruction. It is part of the story itself. It tells us something important. That the figure is genuinely old enough that her original form predates the archives we have access to. What we can follow, because they survive even when names do not, are the symbols. The lion is one of the oldest emblems of divine feminine power in the Near East. It appears in Neolithic figurines. It appears in early Sumerian iconographic seals from the 4th and 5th millennium BCE, long before the great warrior gods of the Bronze Age began to dominate the pictorial record. The lion was not originally a symbol of royal male power in this region. Its oldest association in this geography is with something else, with a kind of sovereign, untamed, protective yet dangerous divine femininity, whose precise name we can no longer recover. The bird, the owl, the raptor, the creature of the night sky, appears in association with goddesses of darkness and transition across a geographic spread that is too wide to be coincidental. From early Sumerian material to Egyptian iconography, to Anatolian religious figures, to the eventual Greek goddess Athena, who kept the owl as her sacred animal, the night bird marks divine feminine presence in liminal spaces, in the territory between what is known and what is not. The serpent, carried by the Greek Lamia in some versions, held in the hands of Lamashtu in every surviving depiction of her, is one of the most ancient markers of transformative divine feminine power in virtually every early civilization we can study. Not originally evil, not originally dangerous, originally associated with wisdom, with regeneration, with the cyclical nature of life and its renewal. These symbols did not begin as signs of monstrosity. They began as signs of power. Very old power, of a specific and sacred kind. At some point, and the evidence suggests the 2nd millennium BCE is a critical window, though the process was gradual and uneven across different regions, something changed in the way that power was categorized. The same figure who carried the lion and the serpent as emblems of divine authority over the night and over the dangerous threshold of birth began to be described as threatening, as transgressive, as something that needed to be expelled rather than honored. The rituals changed their orientation. The language changed. The goddess, in region after region, became the demon, and the Greek Lamia, stripped of all ritual, reduced to a cautionary name, her divine origin replaced by a story of human grief and divine punishment, is the endpoint of that process in the Western tradition. But here is the detail that I keep coming back to, the detail that feels like a fingerprint. The Greek Lamia, in her core story, cannot sleep. Hera took that from her too, reportedly. And so she wanders the night, not because she chooses to, not because the dark is her domain, but because the dark is all that is left to her. The sleep she was denied is gone. The children she protected are gone. The standing she had is gone. In the Babylonian tradition, Lamashtu moves through the night, by nature, by design, as a function of what she is. In the Greek tradition, Lamia moves through the night because she has been robbed of everything else. Do you see the difference? In one version, the night is her territory. In the other, the night is her exile. That is not the invention of a new monster. That is the demotion of an old goddess, documented in the structure of the story itself, preserved by accident in the specific shape of her punishment. What almost certainly existed, somewhere in the chain between the Babylonian deity and the Greek monster, was a figure who governed the night and the dangerous threshold of birth not as a predator, but as a protector. A figure whose proximity to the vulnerable was understood as guardianship, whose association with the hours before dawn was not a threat, but a form of sovereignty over exactly those hours, the ones when infants are most fragile, when fever comes, when the line between arrival and departure is at its thinnest. That figure was real enough to survive for thousands of years across dozens of cultures. Real enough that her symbols stayed consistent long after her name was forgotten. Real enough that even the demonized Greek version of her could not fully erase the original relationship she had with children, only invert it. Her real name, whatever it was before the Babylonians formalized her as Lamashtu, before the Greeks reduced her to Lamia, before the warnings replaced the worship, that name is gone. The clay tablets that might have held it have not been found, or did not survive, or were never written down in a form we have recovered. What remains is the shape of something that was once sacred, a figure of night and of children, and of the wild edge of the world, still recognizable in outline after 3,000 years of translation and reduction and loss. Still carrying her lion, still carrying her serpent, still standing at the threshold, just no longer recognized for what she actually was. And that, to me, is the most quietly haunting idea in all of ancient mythology. Not the monster, not the demon, the goddess underneath, the one nobody remembers, the one who watched over the most dangerous hours of the most vulnerable lives and was, at some point we can no longer identify precisely, reclassified as the threat. What do you think her original name was? What do you think she was before the myths were rewritten and the worship was buried? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to read every single one. If this episode opens something up for you, subscribe to Eternal Legends. Every week we go deeper than the surface, into the real stories, the contested ones, the ones that history almost lost entirely. The ancient world never ran out of mysteries, and neither do we. See you in the next legend.